Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves. We have a new video for you today. I'm starting to get a lot of comments, a lot of suggestions, which is a good thing, but I can't keep up with all of them anymore. But do keep them coming, and I'm going to look for patterns and areas of interest to as many of you as I can. And today I'm going to pick one out that is a pattern for validating a form in Flutter without using RxDart or BLoC. So we're just going to use provider to validate a form. Also going to try a little experiment today where I'm going to write up an accompaniment to this video and put it out online. So look for the link to that in the description down below. Let's get started. Okay, so I have created a new project by typing flutter create validation underscore provider in a terminal. And I'm going to start in main.dart, and we're going to get rid of the code from the demo project. So we'll take this out. And then everything from class my homepage, zapped. Bing. All right. We'll ignore that error for now. Let's grab the packages that we need before we start the emulator. So let's go to pub.dev, and the only thing we need is provider for this. So we'll go to installing, we'll grab this. Can get rid of the browser, come back to pubspec.yaml, and we will paste that right after Cupertino icons. And that's all we need for a package. So in the lib folder, let's take care of this error before we start the emulator. So I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to add src, and then inside src, I'm going to add a new folder for screens. And then inside there, I'm going to create a signup.dart, and that is going to be where we put the form that we are going to validate. And so what I'd like to have is, it's just a real simple form here. We'll have first name, last name, we'll take a date of birth, and then we'll have a submit button. So we'll just have a row for each piece of data, and then the submit button at the bottom. So nothing real complicated here. So this will be class signup. And that's going to extend a stateless widget. And then we need a build method. Great. So I'm just going to sketch this out. We'll put some placeholders here, and then we'll worry about the data part. So we will return a scaffold, and we'll give it an app bar with an app bar widget with a title, which will be a text widget, which will just say sign up. Just sign up is fine. And then we need a body. And for a body, I'm just going to do a list view, and then we each piece of data will be a row in the list. So we'll give that some children, and then I'll just give that a code format, clean things up a little bit. All right, so what I'm going to do is just 3 text fields stacked on top of each other, and then a sign up button. There's 2 ways to validate in Flutter. One is to use a form. The other is to use just text fields without a form. And so I'm going to demonstrate the text field one. I like that one better. It's more responsive, and I think it's a little bit less setup. All right, so the text field is going to take some decoration, and that is going to be input decoration. And so just a couple pieces of information in here. There are a lot of options in here, as you can see. There are actually a lot of options also in text fields, so plenty of opportunities to tailor this to your specific application's needs. But we're just going to worry about a couple of these. So we'll do label text, and that takes a string. And then we need error text, which will be the red text that will show up if we have an error. And this is where we want to put something dynamic, but for now we're just going to put error text just as a placeholder. All right, and then we need onChanged, which is a method for whenever anybody types into the input field, it will call this function, and that needs a value. And we will just leave that empty for now. So I'm going to go ahead and start the emulator. Oh, sorry, here we're going to go to, let's put that home widget and let's put sign up there. That's what we need to eliminate that error. Now we'll get this started. All right, so we got our first name field, and so that's a start. And what I'm going to do is just take that field, add a comma at the end, and just copy it and paste it 2 more times for our last name and our date of birth. All right, we'll format that, and then at the end, let me save that. Then we want a submit button. So let's do a raise button. And we'll give it a child, which will be a text widget, which will say submit. And then an onPress method, which we will leave blank for now. That gives us our nice skeleton. Maybe one more touch before we leave there. Let's wrap list view in some padding. And we'll just leave it at the default. There we go. Okay, so that pretty much is all there is to our presentation logic aside from coming back and filling in these placeholders. So we need a place to store the data. And first of all, we need a data type, and what I'm going to propose is that we create a custom model in a folder for validation that we can use over and over again for validation. So, no, I don't like that. So what I'm going to propose is we create a validation folder and we create a custom object in there, which is a model that we can recycle for validation. So inside lib, what I'd like to do is create a folder called validation. And inside that, I want to create a new file, which is going to be our validation item.dart. And this is going to be a real simple model. We'll give it a class of validation item. And we're just going to give it 2 properties. We'll give it a final string of value and a final string of error. And we'll give it a constructor, which will be a validation item with this.value and this.error. And so the idea here is everything that comes out of a text field is a text. So whether we are entering a date or an email or whatever, that's going to be a string when it comes out of the text field. So this model is something we can feed that value into. If we have an error that we want to convey, we can store that in the error property, and our front end code can figure out whether it wants to display this red error text or whether it wants to allow it through, whether it wants to light this submit button based on the value of this item. All right, so in the validation, let's create another file, and this is going to be signup_validation.dart, and this is going to be the back end code for everything we have on the screen in signup.dart. So if you're familiar with Java, this is going to be akin to a bean. If you're a .NET developer, this is akin to the backend code for Xamarin Forms or web forms. If you are in Angular, it's like the TypeScript file. It's the backing code for the view. And so we'll give it a name. We'll call it class signup validation, and we will include change notifier. So we'll say with change notifier, which allows us to communicate changes in this file out into the widget tree. And I need to bring in material.dart for that. And so up at the top, we are going to create validation items to hold our values. These are going to be private variables. So we'll have one for first name. And we're going to set that equal to validation item. So we're going to instantiate an item, and we're going to set the value to null and the error property to null. And I need to import that. So this gives us our initial value here for the actual field, and also the error. If you wanted to make this, that you could do that. If you wanted to actually put like a default value in a field, you could do that there. I'm going to put in null for starters, and I'm going to do the same thing for last name and date of birth. All right, so those are private variables. We need a way to get those, so let's give ourselves some getters. And what we're going to get are all validation items. So we'll do first name, and that's going to return our private variable. Same thing for last name, and same thing for date of birth. I could copy and paste, but I could use the typing practice. There we go. Now, these are the publicly accessible variables. For the internal variables, we do not want to expose the internal to our user interface. We want to have an entry point right here that's public that doesn't allow you to actually pull that out there and add or change those variables outside of this class. All right, then we need some setters. And so we need one for first name, so we'll create void, we'll call it change first name, and we'll give it a string, which we'll call value. And we want to set our first name equal to the validation item that we would like it to have. So this is an opportunity here as we change the name to validate the data. So let's say for our first name, we want it to be a minimum of 3 characters. So we could say if the value.length is greater than or equal to 3, then we will set our first name equal to validation item of value and null. So what I'm saying here is if it is greater than 3 characters, that meets our validation criteria. So take the value and put it here in the value portion of the validation item. Now, and in that case, we have no error, so we leave that null. So if it's else, we are going to set first name again, but this time we are going to set our value to null and our error property to must be at least 3 characters. And then, very important, whenever dealing with change notify our provider, is we want to notify our listeners. All right, so let's say we want that same validation logic applied to last name. We can just copy and paste and very carefully make sure we get all instances of first name changed to last. Then we have date of birth. And so for date of birth, let's say that we want to have them put it in. Let's change our first name to last name so we get the right label there. Let's change this to date of birth, DOB. And in addition to these fields, let's add a hint for this one. So inside input decoration, we're going to add input text, which says YYY, Y, MMDD. So we want them to enter it in this format here, YYY-MM/DD. And so when we come back here to our validation, we want to make sure that whatever they enter, we can actually create a date time out of. And so we could actually do like a regular expression where we check to make sure that it's in that particular format. But if we pass that string into a date time object for Dart, it should be able to parse it to a datetime object. And if it can do that, then we know it's in the right format. And if it can't, then it's not in the correct format. So for a validator, we could say void, your change DOB is going to get a string because that's all you can get from a text field. But with that value, we're going to try to datetime.parseIt. And if that works, if we get to this line of code and it hasn't jumped out to the catch block, then our DOB, date of birth, is going to be equal to validation item value null. So that's our value, is the value that that has been typed in. We're okay with that being our value. Our error property at that point is null, and so we need a catch. We'll just pass it an error, and the DOB is going to be equal to validation item, and we want null because we're not going to accept that value at all, and we are going to say invalid format is going to be our error text. And not to be forgotten, we need notify listeners. All right, then we should be able to pass these values out to the widget tree and receive them here. And just to be able to do that, though, we are going to need to wrap the widget tree with change notifier provider so we can listen to the changes that we are communicating with notify listeners. So let's wrap material app with change notifier provider. And we need to have imported the provider package. Provider.dart. And we need a create property for our change notifier provider, and that is going to take a context, an arrow function, and what we're going to give it is a new instance of our sign-up validation, which apparently I forgot the O in. Let's get back here. Validation. And like that. All right, so we wrapped it up here at the top level. That means down in our sign-up widget, we can bring it inside of our build method. So we'll give it a var. We'll just do a final. We'll do that. Final. Let's call it validation service. And that's going to be equal to provider.of. We need to bring in provider. Context, and then in between the context and the of, we want to do our type of value that we are looking to bring in. We need to import sign up validation. Sign up validation.dart. There we go. And all the properties we created here are going to be accessible through that method in validation service. So in our first name field, if we have an error, we are going to pass that. It's going to come from validation service dot first name and the error property, because remember, we've created a model, and that model, where is it? That model has a value and it has an error property. And so we can latch on either one of them, and in this case, we want the error property. And in our onChanged, we had that blank, but we want to call the function validation service dot first name, change first name. And into that, we want to pass our value. All right, we want to do the same thing here for our last name. So validation service dot last name dot error. And then in our onChange method, we want validation service dot change last name value. So we're passing in this value to the function. And then for our DOB, validation service DOB dot error. And our function is validation service dot change DOB with our value. All right, so we save that, and I'm just going to do a hot restart. Start typing the name, and we need at least 3 characters, and as soon as we get to 3 characters, that error goes away. Same thing. Yes, I always do that. Total random. All right. And there, same thing with the last name. And then for date of birth, we want a valid item that can be changed into a date, and that is not working correctly. So let's, I got the wrong value there. So let's do change DOB. That's what went wrong. You probably saw me do that. And so we're invalid here until we type something like 2020 04 01, and then it's valid. Great, so that works, and when we can make any of these invalid by taking away the condition, and then they'll bounce back as soon as we have met them. So that's good. The only thing we need finally is to hook up something to the button, because we don't want anybody to be able to submit this button until every field on the form is valid. So let's go back to our sign-up validation. Let's take care of that. And so for our getters, let's create a property that we can feed back to our user interface to let it know if the form is valid. So it'd be a Boolean true false. All right, so let's call that a getter. It'll be a Boolean, it'll be a get, and we'll just call it is valid. And so we can write our own logic here. And in this case, it's really just if the last name dot value does not equal null, and the first name dot value does not equal null, and the DOB dot value does not equal null. That's all we really need for our validation logic. If you had a field that was not required, you just would not need to include it in this string. And we have kind of internally decided that, look, we're passing null here for the value, and only when it's not null have we actually accepted that value and passed it in. And if we haven't, then we are going to either keep null there, or we are going to feed it back in our error function in our validation for that property. All right, so in this case, we're going to return true, and in this case, we're going to return false. And that should get us an active button just to kind of give this a little bit of a real app feel. Let's just add a void for submit data. And so let's just print first name and we'll just print out first name dot value. And then we'll do last name. And last name dot value. And then lastly, our date time. So I'm going to our date of birth. I'm going to actually just do date time dot parse. So we're going to show the actual date time object that we were able to get out of parsing our DOB value. And we know we'll be able to do that because it wouldn't have gotten to this point if it hadn't passed validation. And so this function would be where you call the service that submits to your database or whatever you are doing to store this information. So we'll just kind of simulate that with a print statement. And if we go back to signup.dart and just kind of finish the loop here, our raise button, we're going to have an onPress method. And what we'll do here is we'll just say if not validation service is valid. So if it's not valid, then let's give this null. Otherwise, validation service dot submit data. So it would tell it, and you don't want these parentheses at the end. All right, so this would tell it, go ahead and send that data off to the service. All right, so we hit refresh. We can see now that the submit button is gone. Let me just restart the whole thing just for get the full experience. All right, our button starts out gray, and there's our submit. If we at any point take away information that is needed, the submit button goes away. So that is a pattern where you can use provider only. It is reactive to your typing, and it works pretty well. So let me know what you think of this in the comments. Do you like this pattern? Do you not like this pattern? Is there a better way that we could have done it? Thanks for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this, found it useful, please like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.